I'm so thrilled to have you as part of today's Privacy Exchange Community Show and Tell series. We are honored to have our special guest, Cory Underwood, who also has the very coolest background, as you can see. He will be joining us for a discussion about privacy compliance requirements and turning those into technical realities. So Cory is an engineer who understands marketing. So he is a technical expert in digital analytics, and he's an expert in data protection and data privacy, which is unique and enables him to turn the legal requirements of these laws and regulations into a technical reality for companies. So today we're going to be talking about his work, best practices for forward-thinking marketers, and how he goes about communicating complex technical information to business stakeholders. So for those who've been here before, you know, we do these within a half an hour. So in the next 25 minutes, we're going to split it up in two ways. Cory and I will have a chat through a few interview questions, and then we'll open it up to audience Q&A. We will record the first bit, but we will turn off the recording for the audience Q&A, so feel free to speak freely. As a reminder, the information in our session is for general information purposes only and is not legal advice. If you need legal advice, talk to your own attorney to get your answers answered. So, okay, Cory, are you ready to hop in?
I am. Thank you for having me.
Right, we're so happy you're here. Okay, so I'm curious. You're an engineer with a marketing focus, and you help companies turn their data privacy compliance requirements into technical aspects. Can you share with us some of the type of work that you do for clients, or talk about any recent projects you've just completed?
Sure. So I kind of got into this because at a previous company, I was responsible for like the data collection, all the analytics processing. And so I got in the habit of reading like the browser patch notes because that's how people interact with the website. And when they started adding in privacy controls and modifying how cookies work, I equated that to the systems that I was responsible for. And then I had to explain why they were going to start seeing deltas or shifts in the data that they were getting reported on. So that's how I kind of rolled into that. And that was before a lot of the regulation rolled out. But when like Safari blocked third-party cookies, for example, that has clear implications for things like advertising measurement. So I had to engage the paid media teams to basically be like, okay, your return on investment metrics might be skewed because the actual advertiser is not going to know that the conversion happened because of this thing. And with marketers, they're not reading the browser patch notes. And even if they did, they don't have the understanding of like necessarily how the platform itself works. But you need to have that understanding of how the measurement, for example, works in order to make that leap.
Interesting. So I'm actually hearing not only did you read the technical notes of the browser, but you had to understand how the marketers were measuring this. How
Mhm.
did you go about getting the information from the marketers? And then on the opposite side, like how do you communicate these complex technical happenings to the marketing team? Can you share a bit about like how you go about doing that?
Sure. So, well, like different platforms have training. Like you could take Google Analytics training, you read the developer documentation. Like Adobe has its own documentation. A lot of it is very dry, but it's like if you read the developer documentation, it actually says like, here's how it technically has to work.
Mhm.
And then if you're, I've also taken like some paid media courses. So I have a general concept of like the types of metrics they would be looking at.
Mhm.
So understanding how they get to those metrics technically from reading the developer documentation allows me to like read notes written for other engineers, but actually understand the business impact of that change.
Fascinating. So I'm curious when that happens and you're reading these technical documents, and what kinds do you find yourself reading? You mentioned Adobe, you mentioned Google Analytics. What else do you read often?
Yeah, so I read the different, there's four major browsers really. So I read all of their different updates. Occasionally, I pay attention, particularly anything related to privacy or security, because that can change how stuff has to work.
Mhm.
Um, I also pay attention to different security updates, particularly in like web application components, because that's what I work with most often.
Interesting. Do you have like a compare and contrast document? Like you just throw everything in there and like look, or do you actually every time a release comes out, you read it from front to back?
Well, they're usually only like a page or two long, so I skim it, but I pay attention mostly to the privacy and security sections.
Yeah. So, okay, so once you've done that, so now you've got to figure out like, so what do we actually do with this, right? So what happens then? You're reading this technical documentation and like tell me what's something that would pop up for you that like would catch your eye. And then now what do you tell the marketing team?
So here's a good example. Safari will limit cookie duration to like a week potentially, or
Okay.
less, certain conditions. So if you have an optimization team which is doing A/B testing, that might be problematic for them because unless you have extreme amounts of volume, you probably need your A/B test to run longer than a week. So
Mhm.
what would happen is the device would get potentially reallocated every time it comes back to the site. So the experience wouldn't be consistent for the user, so that's not an ideal user experience, but it really messes with the statistics to get like a valid test. So they would need to know that because potentially they're making a business decision on whether or not they should adopt a feature off of those results.
Fascinating. Okay, so in this example that you shared, so you're time bound by a week. So do you go to the marketing team and say, "Hey, this A/B test has to be done within a week now," or like what would you advise the team after learning that?
So what happened with the industry is they recognized that using cookies was going to be restricted, so they went to local storage. Then Safari came back and restricted local storage. So then they went to server cookies, and then they came back and so it's like a cat and mouse game. So you have two options. You can kind of try to fix the exact issue with ignoring the overarching goal of the browser, or you can try to work in harmony with it, and so you're not constantly like playing cat and mouse with it. Um, Different businesses have different priorities in regards to which one of those approaches they would prefer.
Mhm. Interesting. And I'm curious, do you find something that has come up recently is like advising the business and getting them to do an action that is in like a technical best interest? Like, how do you communicate to them, like, hey, this is going to be the best, the most feasible path forward. We have to make a change because change is hard. How do you go about actually communicating this to non-technical folks?
It's depending on what the change is. So, for example, say you were involved with like payment card industry data security standards, so PCI DSS. Those are a series of requirements around processing of credit cards, essentially. They're not very amenable to not meeting the minimum thresholds for processing of credit cards. So the risk there is you should do this. The risk if you don't is you might be found in violation of the standards and they might suspend your ability to process credit cards. Whereas other things, like on the privacy front, it's not as clear cut because the enforcement hasn't really been there yet with the same regularity outside of certain industries. So in that case, it's more common for the lawyers or the business folks to make a judgment call over what they consider the likelihood of enforcement and what the potential risk of that enforcement is.
Okay, so this is fascinating because like it's rare that I ever see the inside of those conversations, those business decisions to like risk it or not. So how do you protect yourself? Do you make like notes and say like this is what I've advised you, this is the problem, or do you just stay in your lane as a technical person and be like I've given you the information, that's on you now? Like how do you advise in a way that feels true to you, is getting the point across, but is also like it's not, I guess, your decision to make?
So what I might make is a couple different recommendations and highlight the different risks as I see them related to those. And if they're engineering based as opposed to process based, like I can also kind of quantify to some degree like the amount of effort it would take to do that thing.
Mhm.
But there are certain things that are like easy from an engineering point of view, but can have dramatic business impact. So like you need to understand how what you're recommending may impact other systems. So an example of that would be like opt-in versus opt-out for consent. When an opt-in scenario, you're going to, in most cases, tank a lot of the optional things like advertising measurement. And the business needs to know that if they decide to do that, which they may be required to in, like, say, Europe, that it's going to impact metrics somewhere else. So it's you can do that, but you can't stop there. You also need to modify your strategy for this other thing.
Fascinating. And I'm curious just from your experience, because you're in a number of different conversations, because you work with clients, right? That's how your business works. You have multiple different clients. Do you find that businesses are waiting for that enforcement, or they're being proactive and doing what the laws or the spirit of the regulations asking for?
I think it's going to come down to the individual business and how much capacity they may have to pay off an enforcement action should one be levied.
Yeah.
Uh, the risk potentially would be in the United States is for anything that's publicly facing. Like the FTC might not enforce against you, but if they do, it's probably going to really hurt.
Yeah.
So you have to kind of balance those things, and you could potentially dramatically lower your risk by just ensuring that you're being upfront and honest. You could have like the worst privacy practices in the world, but as long as that's what it says in your privacy policy, the FTC is going to leave you alone.
Yeah. No, the unfair deceptive trade practices is definitely creeping up, and being upfront is going to save you a lot of heartache. So, and this is my final question for you then before we open it up to the audience. Um, how do you deal with when technical realities of what you're doing do not match the privacy notice?
You need to fix one or the other. So you need to either fix the technology to match the notice, or you need to fix the notice to match the policy.
Yeah.
So depending on your industry, one of those may be preferable. So, like, for example, if you're a health industry, like you may not be able to change the policy because it needs to have certain things in it. So you need to fix the technology. Whereas in the other case, it's like you send it back to legal for a review with a series of notes on like why this isn't technically true. And then
Mhm.
they can make the decision to update that or not.
Yeah, gotcha. Well, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much, Cory. I will stop now. Let's just stop the recording and then go ahead and open this up to